And then also during the presentation of Anna, then she will also remind you, if you have any questions, please do write them in the chat, and then we will pick it up when we have the time for the plenary discussion. And I think, Mario, from my side, that's it, and I will hand over to you for a little bit of introduction. So thank you very much for everybody. We're really excited that you're all here with us today.
Thank you, Gio. It's lovely to see so many familiar faces and to see a few new ones too. We just wanted to share a few words on the working group because it's quite new and it will help to frame why we're organizing this webinar. Hi, Ingrid. Great that you could join us too.
Hi.
Hi. So the working group on participation displacement was launched during the global CCCM retreat last month. So it's still really new. And what we want to do with the working group is we want to create a platform where best practices and key learning can be shared. But we also want to identify gaps which might exist in tools and guidance and see how we can help filling those gaps specifically for CCCM actors, of course. But we're also understanding the fact that we can learn a lot from other specialists or other actors. So we're also looking towards protection, gender GBV, to really be as comprehensive as possible, which is why it's also really, really great to see so many colleagues joining today who are not necessarily CCCM practitioners. We'll come back to the working group at the end of the webinar. In the past few years, IOM and NRC have been working very closely together in a partnership under the Women's Participation Project that we as IOM have been leading with support from Women's Refugee Commission and of course in coordination with the Global CCCM Cluster. The Women's Participation Project, I won't give too much explanation about now because it's not the main focus of the webinar, but for those who are interested, please have a look at womenindisplacement.org. You can also find all of the reports and tools that have been created in partnership with NRC over the past years. NRC has done a lot of work at taking the Women's Participation Project and applying it to displacement settings where NRC, of course, have the expertise. So looking at urban displacement, looking at informal settlements. More specifically, NRC has implemented it in Afghanistan last year. And the past year, Anna has been doing a lot of research, which we'll hear about more now, which is super, super interesting. And hopefully this partnership will continue. So it's been a very productive and fruitful partnership, and we're very happy to be sharing the findings from last year's research with you. As Gio said, if you have any questions for Anna during her presentation, please type them in the chat and we'll come back to them after the presentation from Anna. So for now, I'll put myself on mute again and hand over to Anna. Anna, the floor is yours.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm going to share my screen now so that you can see the presentation. Hopefully it's going to work. Okay. There we go. I've got my pointer. So just a little bit of background on kind of where this research came from. So as Mario mentioned, this is kind of part of a broader women's participation project, which started out with the development of the Women's Participation Toolkit together with the Women's Refugee Commission. And that's what you can find on the website that Mario just mentioned. And from 2016 to 2018, this was rolled out in various different contexts by IOM, WRC, and also by NRC. And in particular, NRC kind of adapted the toolkit for use in an urban out-of-camp environment in Afghanistan, in the East region. And based on some of the findings from rolling out that toolkit there were a few kind of questions that we wanted to explore a bit more. So that then led to the research that I've been working on this year. So the objectives of the research were threefold. Firstly, we wanted to see, firstly, maybe just to mention that there were two components of the research. One was looking more at the role of elderly women. and how they're supporting their communities in displacement. And the other component was looking at the role of women in coordination specifically. And that's what the presentation today is concentrating on. So firstly, wanted to understand a bit more, what are women contributing to coordination and what are the barriers that they're facing, and also the enablers. And then what specifically is the role that camp management agencies in their mandate can do to improve women's participation and their influence through coordination. And then in turn, to see how women's role in coordination can actually address some safety and protection issues facing women and girls in displacement. So the research activities covered, there was a desk review component and also a field component to address both secondary and primary sources. So the field work, we wanted to look at a range of different contexts, both outside of camps, informal sites and formal sites, in both urban and peri-urban or rural settings. So I had fieldwork in Iraq and Kenya. I had colleagues in Afghanistan conduct fieldwork there. I also went to Tanzania, but couldn't actually get an entry permit for the camp, so my fieldwork was restricted there to talking to service providers. And then I also had some interviews with other camp management staff in other contexts. So in Iraq, I was looking at two separate projects. One was working in an informal settlement called Kilo 7, hosting IDPs and IDP returnees. This is a photograph you can see now. Then I was also looking at the urban kind of outside of settlements or camps component of NRC's project in Iraq as well, in Ramadi city. This is an informal settlement in Kabul, Afghanistan. And this is a formal site that was just newly established last year in response to drought-induced displacement. And then this is Kalubiye integrated settlement, which is a refugee camp, hosting refugees from many different countries, but primarily South Sudan and Somalia. So I spoke to more than 200 individuals. The majority of these were actually community leaders and representatives. So in terms of looking at women's role in coordination, I was concentrating on women who were already in leadership structures or governance structures or assigned as focal points, had some kind of position already. And I also spoke with camp management staff and also other service provider staff. And as you can see, the majority of my informants were female, but I spoke to men as well. So just to touch on why specifically we were interested in this research for camp management. So camp managers have many responsibilities. Two of the key responsibilities are, one is coordination, at the camp level, or when we're working outside of camps, then coordination on an area basis, or in informal sites. And then another key responsibility is making sure that there is structured and meaningful participation of the displaced community members in decision making. So we wanted to kind of bring those two components together. Then the other thing is that we also know that there are many barriers for women's participation generally in all spheres and all over the world. So we wanted to kind of look at those barriers in relation to coordination specifically. And there's also plenty of evidence which shows that there is an improvement in humanitarian outcomes when women are participating. So we wanted to bring all of those together and also to address this specific question of improving women's safety and protection. So just to define the terms a bit and how I was understanding coordination in the research. So coordination was understood as a collaborative process that involves engaging with a range of different stakeholders. So for community members to be engaging with external stakeholders from within, but also from outside their community, for information sharing and planning to solve problems. So it's kind of problem solutions oriented. And what this means in practice, I was kind of understanding coordination to comprise of various different activities. So meetings, both formal and informal, regular and ad hoc meetings, reporting of various kinds, conducting referrals and contributing to service mapping, and participating in monitoring and of services. So now we'll move on to the findings. This is a photograph of some women that I met in Iraq for some coordination. I'll talk more about that later. So I found that women were involved in many elements of coordination in these camp management projects, but generally less so than men, which wasn't a huge surprise. And particularly less so than men when it came to meeting with external stakeholders. Men were more often involved in meetings and attending meetings, and also more likely to contribute during those discussions and during those meetings. Women were kind of shyer. But there were also other elements that women were involved in, generally in a kind of ad hoc or informal way. So some of them were involved in collecting some notes, providing some verbal reports to camp management staff, or sometimes lists of names. Some of them were involved in some kind of monitoring activities, but these were generally quite ad hoc. Then something I also found particularly from speaking with service providers, was that they really valued women's contributions when they were involved in coordination. They found that women often had a better understanding of, particularly of household needs than men, and of any of the kind of issues relating to women's tasks. So in camps, for example, often the firewood collection, and in some cases women were involved in collecting humanitarian aid. And they also said that women were often more solutions oriented than men, and would kind of come up with more creative and practical solutions, and even in some cases had more of a general interest in the wider community rather than just on their own households and themselves. And finally, all of the informants emphasised that women were much more aware of and responsive to issues of women's safety and protection, including GBV. So I'll just go through a few examples of the kind of impact and influence that we see women having when they are involved in coordination. And I found encouraging examples of this in all of the contexts. So, for example, in Afghanistan, women from one of the women's committee were involved in negotiating with a landowner to avoid eviction. They also coordinated with the Ministry of Education to have literacy classes for adult women. They coordinated with some WASH NGOs for building of bore wells, and they also managed to work with the local business, which I think was being supported by a local NGO as well, to provide some tailoring skills courses for women in the site. In Iraq, the women kind of volunteers, focal points there, they were coordinating primarily with NRC through the camp management team, but they managed to address many issues. So one of them was that, you may have noticed from the photograph, they're living among collapsed buildings which still contain unexploded ordnance. So they worked on working with NRC to put up fences and danger signs. They also advocated for fixing of electrical wiring. And through monitoring, they were able to identify that the local waste collectors provided by the municipality were demanding money from households, which was contrary to what was meant to be happening. So they managed to raise their jobs. And finally, they coordinated with the provider of the child-friendly space to provide psychosocial support sessions for children in the space. In Kenya, many of the women were involved in coordinating with peace committees. These were the women leaders, so they would coordinate with peace committees and also with the Refugee Affairs Secretariat, which is the Kenyan authorities who are managing the site, to address issues of conflict within the camp, and also to address issues of GBV. They were also involved in monitoring shelters, and particularly empty shelters, which they would then report to the Refugee Affairs Secretariat, and also to the Shelter Agency. And they were coordinating with the site planning agency around the location of brick harvesting sites to make sure that that was safe for women. In Tanzania, the Tanzanian Red Cross said that the women were very much involved in monitoring service delivery in their health points and health clinics, and reporting those back to the Red Cross, who could then report to the donor and advocate for improvement in services based on the feedback from the women. So despite these very encouraging examples, I also found many barriers to women's participation. And of course, the kind of underlying barrier to all of this is to do with the patriarchal culture in these contexts. This probably doesn't come as a surprise to any of you, as it didn't to me, but what was interesting was to look at how precisely this kind of played out for the impact that it was having on women's role in coordination. So what I found was that it was linked to a range of different kind of barriers, and they're all intersecting. So besides the culture, there's then the kind of structural exclusion of women. There's the fact that, so having more men in positions of kind of public positions, the fact that men tend to have more experience in education than women, and the fact that women often lack confidence. So I'll just explain now kind of how these all link together. So on the cultural side, we see that often if governance structures are created, then men tend to be the ones who by default kind of volunteer or are put in those positions of authority. And then even if the structures include women as well, we see that men tend to be the ones who attend meetings more often, and they speak up more in meetings compared to women. What I also found, and this seemed kind of particularly obvious in the out-of-camp setting, was that men had many kind of informal social and professional networks, many of which they kind of developed pre-crisis, which enabled them to play a role in coordination, and women don't have these kind of pre-existing networks. The other issue is that still we find that often the majority of humanitarian field staff are men, which of course limits their communication with women. And that also, regardless of the gender of the field staff, humanitarians are still often speaking to the kind of easiest to access community gatekeepers, and they are inevitably men. And this happens particularly in informal camps and out of camp settings where alternative structures may not be put in place, and so pre-existing leaders are almost always male. But even in formal camps we see this as well. So in Bangladesh and in Myanmar, the kind of camp governance structures that have been put in place by authorities all comprised of men. And then on a very practical level, culture leads to barriers for women's kind of attendance in meetings. So perhaps lack of permission to leave their homes, to go to public buildings, the fact that they have various responsibilities in the home which prevent them from going out. Then we have the link between culture and capacities and skills. So in many of the contexts that I looked at, in many contexts in the world, men are more educated than women. And this has quite an impact on their ability to participate in coordination. So on the one hand, this then means that women have fewer kind of the soft skills required for coordination. But then there's also some like specific concrete skills that they might be lacking that would enable them to have more of an impact on coordination. So, for example, often there are language barriers. So, for example, in Kenya and Tanzania, the language of coordination is Swahili and English, and men more often have these language skills than women. Also in terms of writing reports, writing lists of names, writing petitions, this is something that men with literacy skills would be more able to do. And also just in terms of resources, men often had access to certain material resources which facilitated their role in coordination that women were lacking. So for example, having bicycles that enable them to reach meetings, having mobile phones, which means they can call the service providers. Women often didn't have access to these things. This, of course, links back to the structural exclusion, because what I also found was that many people, like non-leaders as well, said that they preferred to, when they were thinking of who to elect as leaders, they wanted to elect people who were more educated. So this would often be men. And the other kind of factors I mentioned around the fact that, you know, if women don't speak the language, then it's very difficult for them to participate in the meetings. But the lack of education, it also, another key finding was that lack of education leads to lack of confidence. And that creates a huge barrier for women's participation, which is also reinforced by culture, and it's kind of a mutually reinforcing thing. So if there's a culture whereby women don't feel like they can speak up in front of men, then this makes it very difficult for them to go and meet with male service providers or to speak up in coordination meetings. But many women as well said that because they were less educated, they didn't feel confident, and they particularly didn't feel confident in coordinating in forums where they perceived that others were more educated than themselves. And then finally, there's, again, we can link lack of confidence back to the structural exclusion, which I've touched on already. So women being less likely to volunteer for leadership positions. So even if they're open to men and women, women just don't volunteer for them. And then the more they're excluded, the more they feel shy to participate. And then another thing I found was that even when you do have women, they're in the structures, they're attempting to participate, they're attempting to solve problems, and then they find that they get no response from service providers and they're unable to solve their issues. And this undermines their credibility and undermines their confidence in the eyes of the community, and can actually be quite damaging to their confidence and their legitimacy. So all of this kind of combines into a perfect storm to limit their participation. Now, this is a lot for a camp management agency to tackle, and I don't think it's something that, obviously, a camp management agency alone cannot tackle these things. But what I found and what I recommend in the report is that by concentrating on the structural exclusion and the lack of capacities and resources, by concentrating on those two components, you start to have an impact on the other barriers as well. So basically working on finding ways to actually adjust the structures and make sure that there is structural inclusion and supporting development of women's capacities and resources. So now I'll just come to the recommendations, basically. So on the kind of structural inclusion side of things, the first and kind of like minimal step is making sure that your structures involve equal participation of women and men, that those structures are formalized and recognized by all the stakeholders, so both by community, by other service providers, by other community governance mechanisms if they exist. And ideally there should be some kind of legal foundation for this. So in Kenya, for example, the leadership structure of the camp was embedded in the constitution of the camp, which was also further kind of underpinned by the Kenyan legal framework. And this was something that all the leaders were trained in, and certainly seemed to help the extent to which women were able to participate in coordination there. So, and this isn't something that's just done at the beginning of the project and then it's done. Camp Management Agency has to have an ongoing role in proactively promoting the structure, making sure it's seen as legitimate, linking them to stakeholders to kind of enhance their role. Then secondly, a very practical recommendation is around how meetings are managed. I'm sure this is practiced by many colleagues in the field already, but I think it's always worth reminding ourselves to think about things like the time of day, the duration of the meeting, the location, the transport to get there, and considering very carefully about whether or not the meeting should be single-sex or mixed. And actually the same is true of the governance structures themselves, whether you can have a mixed gender governance structure or they should be separate, and if they are separate, how to make sure that they are linking together and coordinating with each other. Also, even in how you're chairing the meetings, if you've got mixed genders, making sure that women are given the space to speak, and that might involve proactively inviting them to speak. Thirdly, I found that providing a physical space for women's coordination was really critical in all of the contexts, both outside of camp and inside of camps. Outside of camp, there was a risk that by having a community centre, for example, where coordination was focused, that the coordination would become focused on activities taking place in the community centre and thereby kind of neglect the problems that women might be trying to address in their own neighbourhoods. So that has to be carefully managed. But in the camps, also having a physical space was seen as important, particularly in restrictive environments where women might not otherwise be able to attend coordination meetings. And also their own offices, and just having that physical space kind of provides them with legitimacy in their role. And then an important thing to remember is that coordination involves more than just meetings. So considering other methods and tools that can facilitate women's role in coordination, and particularly methods that might not be so affected by women's lack of confidence, for example. So reporting tools and monitoring tools, and maybe looking into some digital technologies to explore that. And then I mentioned that, particularly in the out-of-camp context, men tended to have a lot more kind of informal social and professional networks than women. But what I also found in the out-of-camp context was that some more educated women and women working for local authorities and things like this, they did have quite extensive networks. So the suggestion is to create women's coordination networks that bring together like many different stakeholders, including kind of non-traditional stakeholders in terms of humanitarian responders, so non-humanitarians, let's say, and really working to kind of cultivate women's social and professional networks so that all of these kind of informal methods of coordination can be enhanced. And then finally, of course, the obvious one is making sure that there's adequate female representation in the camp management team, and ideally in other agencies as well, but we have control over our own teams only, I suppose. Then on the side of capacities and resources, one component of this is about the camp management agency really taking ownership over the capacity building plan for the women, also for the men, but concentrating on the learning needs of the women. Now, this, there might be some components of the training that would need to be provided by other agencies, but the camp management agency kind of takes ownership of the plan. And this might include literacy and language training, for example. And then besides the kind of training, providing ongoing coaching and support and kind of backstopping the women in their coordination role is really essential. So if women are just kind of left by themselves to coordinate, and then they're struggling to contact service providers, or they're not able to get a response from service providers, then camp management agencies should be there supporting them, helping them to build those links, helping to chase agencies that might not be responding to them. And then, even better, ideally, would be to have some resources assigned to actually provide a tangible response to the problems that women are raising. And even if this means concentrating on some kind of quick wins, the value of that, as well as addressing a problem they have themselves prioritized, it also starts giving them legitimacy, because people can see that they are actually able to solve problems that they're raising. And then finally, providing some other material resources that aid coordination. So this might be mobile phones, bicycles I mentioned, and there are a few other items that were mentioned by the women in different contexts. And then in addition, potentially access to livelihoods opportunities. So lots of research has shown that once women have more access to economic opportunities and they're empowered economically, this increases their confidence, it increases their interaction with other stakeholders, and increases their ability to play a role in public life. So linking up livelihoods programs with the governance mechanisms could be valuable. But there are also risks involved in that if the women in governance structures start benefiting from livelihoods projects to the expense of other vulnerable women in the community, then that they might be perceived badly for that. So, of course, that has to be considered. And now just come back to the topic of women's safety and protection specifically, and how involving women in coordination can help to address that. There's several recommendations linked to this. So, and again, they're kind of divided on the structural side and the capacities side. So on the structural side, we know that there are kind of increasing numbers of community-based approaches across sectors, but including within protection. So protection focal points, protection committees, and so on. So making sure that there's a coordinated and complementary approach between the kind of more general governance and coordination mechanisms and those protection-specific mechanisms could really kind of add value to the role of the protection community-based mechanisms and the wider governance mechanisms. Secondly, the camp management agency should really be proactive in making sure that the women are able to meet with any of the agencies who implement services that have an impact on women's safety. So that's obviously not just the women's protection and GBV providers, but you know, the WASH and site planning, education, all of the sectors who, of course, it's in their own kind of safe programming best practice. They should be consulting with women, but they might not know that they should link specifically with the women from governance mechanisms who have the skills and knowledge about the wider needs of the community. And then in case the governance structures comprise of a mixed gender kind of forum, just to make sure that gender segregated meetings do take place as well. Men with male staff and women with female staff, to make sure that each group can raise issues that they might not feel comfortable raising with others. On the capacities side, making sure that women are trained and supported to kind of map and monitor safety risks on an ongoing basis, and also supporting them to present these back to stakeholders. And perhaps assigning resources to actually address those issues. And here, I mean, there are tools already. So for example, the safety mapping tool from the Women's Participation Toolkit, but maybe taking that tool and adapting it a little bit so it's something that the women from the governance structures can themselves implement with other women in the community. So it doesn't have to be only facilitated by camp management staff. And then finally, we know that women are more involved in identifying and being aware of GBV issues. So making sure that they are trained on GBV response and prevention, including referral principles and pathways. Some of this might be delivered by the camp management agency, but there would probably be some more kind of specialized and sensitive topics that ideally would be provided by the GBV actor, so would obviously require coordination with them. So that brings me to the concluding slide, which kind of brings everything together. So by supporting the structural inclusion of women in the structures of coordination, we're ensuring their participation, but to make sure that they're actually able to have an influence through that participation, we also need to make sure that their skills and capacities are built as well, and that they're actually able to respond to problems that they're raising. This together will help to increase their confidence, which has a kind of reinforcing effect, and enhances their legitimacy and their space in the public sphere for solving problems. And hopefully all of this comes together to ensure or improve women's safety and protection. So now I'm very open to questions and further discussion.
So thank you very much, Anna. I took notes, like 4 or 5 people already wrote down the question in the chat, but I will ask the person that wrote the question in the chat to repeat it for all of us.
Just a question, do you want me to keep the slideshow up, or shall I stop sharing?
No, maybe stop sharing.
Yeah,
so
we can see each other.
Jennifer, you had 2 questions. Do you mind to repeat it to Anna? We have now like 20 minutes for 20 minutes, 25 maximum. No, Jennifer, I don't see her anymore. Jennifer? Otherwise, there was Celeste that had the question.
I'm here, Gio.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, I had to figure out how to unmute. Anna, it's really great research, and I'm so glad that you did it. I'm wondering if you could elaborate anywhere where women might have said that they were interested in participating more or coordinating more, any particular topics. You had great examples from the different places, but is there anywhere where they said, I really wish we could be involved in X, or I really wish we could have been involved in Y? That was my first question. And then my second question was about the kind of barriers to women's participation, and you talked a lot about setting up those structures, but I'm wondering if you had any practical tips in how to go about setting up formal structures where women could coordinate or could participate in a way that in particularly in areas where doing so would put them at further harm, or the agency advocating for setting up those structures might be perceived as putting women at harm. So I'm thinking specifically of our colleagues that are calling in from Northwest Syria, or if in Afghanistan or in Iraq, where, or even Bangladesh, where women are almost sometimes more in danger by wanting to participate. So could you add some practical tips? Where did they want to, and what could we do to really encourage that in areas where it's not perceived as favorable?
Yeah, so on the first question, there was a lot of variety, I would say, between different women in different contexts. So it's hard to point to kind of general themes. What was interesting is that, and this is not just from my research, but from my previous experience of working with women, is that sometimes at the beginning, it was hard for them almost to get their head around the concept or the prospect of having this kind of public role and working on community problems. So sometimes initially their focus was maybe on addressing the immediate needs of their own family. This is something I've seen with men as well. But then with some kind of training and coaching, then they start to kind of get the concept that they're looking out for the wider community. And then, I mean, many issues come up, but some of the ones that kind of pop into my head, and so they presumably thereby came up more than others, was education. So they were often really concerned about education of both girls and boys, and also livelihoods for their husbands, but also for themselves. So these were the kind of issues that they wanted to address through coordination. On your second question, in terms of potential harm for women participating. So in Afghanistan, and we do have a couple of colleagues from Afghanistan, so they might want to add on this later as well. There were some kind of concerns expressed by men in the community, and those seem to be mainly linked towards the fact that when we were coordinating with the women, it was taking place in the community centres that we'd established. So this meant women had to leave their homes and come to the community centre. And some community members were not happy about the women coming to the community centres and were worried about that. What the staff have told me when I spoke to some of them for this research was that they then had discussions with the men. They talked about, you know, the need for women's involvement, and they explained to them what happens in the community centres and invited them to come and visit the community centres, see what happens there, see that there is a specific space for women and there are women staff, and that did help to address some of the issues. Yeah.
Okay.
That's a great example. Thanks.
Then we had Celeste that had one questions. Is it correct?
Hi. Yes, that's me. First of all, Anna, thank you for your presentation. Super interesting. I wanted to pick up a little on the topic of education as a barrier of participation for women. I think you partially answered my question after I wrote it, but basically I'm interested to know if you identified specific topics besides literacy that you already mentioned that women find as important to improve their education, even if it's informal education. And I remember that, for example, in the Women's Participation Project in Bangladesh, there was a lot of for women to be able to speak up or to present different topics, and then they received different types of training in, like, you know, managing disasters or protection or GBV cases, a lot of different things. And like in that case, like, it did show that besides the content of the training itself, they really appreciated being able to, you know, be more confident, and that then had repercussions on their capacity to participate. So specifically, my question is, if you identified what subjects women would be interested to be trained in besides literacy, that of course requires a lot of investment, I think.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, something that was kind of surprising to me was that a lot of the time they didn't have particular feedback on specific topics that they wanted to be trained on. They just wanted training. And when I asked them about the training they had and what they appreciated, they just said they appreciated all of it because it helped to build their confidence. But one pattern was, and something they found particularly kind of practically useful, was training on service providers. So about which service providers are acting in the area, what they're doing, how to contact them, what their beneficiary selection processes are, all of this kind of stuff to actually enable them to understand the way humanitarian agencies are working and how they can actually interact with them and influence them. So that definitely came up. And then, I mean, some of the other topics that were raised were around leadership and communication, problem solving, conflict resolution. And also in Kenya especially, actually, a lot of the women mentioned that they'd had training on kind of legal foundations of, like, for women's rights and the governance structures in the site. And I think that was important for them, for kind of giving them a sense of their own legitimacy in that position, and also being able to kind of justify their roles. But another point is that many of the service providers mentioned that training lesser educated women and illiterate women is much more challenging. Like, it's harder for them to understand concept, to grasp concepts, to retain information, to use that information. So the way in which we train literate women and illiterate women has to be a little bit different, I think. Or at least the trainings should be designed in such a way that they're accessible to illiterate women, and they'll then be accessible to literate women as well, but to go with the lowest common denominator.
Okay. Thank you very much, Anna. We have another question from Wanijira. Sorry, I cannot pronounce your name properly.
No, you're correct. It's correct. It's Wanjira. Yes. Yeah, you're pronouncing it very well. Thank you. Thank you very much, Anna, for a very interesting presentation. And the question I wanted to ask is, if you noticed in the different countries where you did the research, that elderly women tend to be sidelined, especially when they have a lower level of education, because this was my experience in the informal settlements where I've been working. And the second question I wanted to ask, actually, I don't know if it's a question or a suggestion, is that sometimes, contrary to what you said earlier, women are more into, are more familiar, active in informal structures than men. So actually sometimes it's easier, much easier to reach women, you know, like women are more actively involved in, you know, what they call in Kenya, merry-go-round, you know, money-making schemes and things like those. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I'm very glad you asked the question on elderly women, because the other component of this research that I didn't talk about today was about the elderly women and the role that they play. But unfortunately, I did find a lot of exclusion of elderly women. I mean, what counts as elderly is also kind of context specific. But I spoke to many older women and they did feel like they were excluded and that they didn't have a chance to contribute their expertise and experience anymore, and that their position in the community as kind of advisors and carriers of tradition was being eroded in their positions of displacement, especially in the camp environments where there was a very heavy presence of NGOs. Outside of camps, it wasn't so much that they felt that NGOs were eroding their role, but they weren't included in any of the activities. But at the same time, when I, like older women, yes, excluded, but the kind of older women on the younger end of the spectrum, let's say, so women in their kind of 50s and 60s, were actually quite involved, and proportionate to how many were in the community, that was kind of, it was proportionate as to how many were in the governance structures, at least in Afghanistan and Iraq, which is where I had the age data for. And speaking, especially in Afghanistan, actually, my colleagues there were saying that the older women often have more freedom of movement than younger women, and more able to meet with men. And even some of the kind of traditional leaders in the community would consult with older women and would invite them to meetings with service providers. So I think, and one of the recommendations from my kind of companion report is to really make sure that older women are included in governance structures, because they have a lot of kind of experience and authority and freedom. That means they can play a really valuable role in coordination, and they can support younger women as well at the same time. On your second question about women being more active in informal structures, yeah, I think that's true, and I think often there's a danger that humanitarian agencies will kind of, camp management or otherwise, will come in and establish their own structures without understanding what community structures or informal community structures are already in place, and how to support them and how to build on them. And again, this comes back to the point on elderly women, actually, because I found in Kenya, in Kakuma camp, that some elder women were involved in some like traditional councils, and were also kind of playing like a representation role, but they weren't recognized or acknowledged at all by the humanitarian actors there, which is a real missed opportunity. So yeah, I mean, camp management agencies need to understand the existing structures and think about, if they're creating new structures, think about how those are going to interact with existing structures, and how they can build on the experience and expertise of existing structures.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. And we have a couple of more people with questions. There is Elaimar, that you had one or two questions. Elaimar? Otherwise,
I can see Elamyar's questions. So he's asking, did you come across cases where women?
oh, he's online, Anna. 1 second. Elamyar?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, I can hear. First of all, thank you and all the participants, and especially Anna, to arrange such a meeting. My first question is that as Anna was reading it, that it was, for example, did she come across the women where they could will participate or have a willingness to participate only in if the coordination meeting is attended and running by women, since this is more important in some culture. As she knows better, and she spent some time in Afghanistan, that in Afghanistan, whenever there is only women meetings or coordination running or just leading by women, that other women could easily or willingnessly participate. And also another question, and it is also important that in Afghanistan, according to culture, women don't have to be responsible for family expenses, or shortly, they are not breadwinners in their rules, and more about working inside the houses, taking care of the children and do household activities. Therefore, we cannot expect women in Afghanistan to participate 100% like that's all.
Okay. Yes, so on the first point, yeah, of course, as we both experienced in Afghanistan, in some contexts, women don't want to attend, or men in the community don't want women to attend meetings with staff who are not female. So this is why having female staff is absolutely essential, and not just female camp management staff, but female staff from other agencies, because we found this in Afghanistan, that it was very hard for the women to meet with other agencies and service providers because they didn't have sufficient female staff. So, I mean, the camp management agency can do some advocacy, you know, at the country level if this is an issue, to encourage other agencies to have female staff. And then on the second question about cultures where women aren't expected to have a breadwinning role in the family. Yes, absolutely. So this comes back to my point about how culture kind of underpins everything. So yes, if their expectation is that women's role is only in the home, then this can kind of limit the extent to which they expect themselves to participate in coordination and others expect them to participate. But interestingly, what I found, for example, in Iraq, some of the men were saying, the women think that we don't want them to coordinate with others. And so that's why we do the coordination. So it was almost as though they were saying, it's not that we're forbidding them from doing it, but it's just, that's just the expectation. The expectation is that men do the external coordination and women focus on the home. And so I think then once you start kind of discussing with the community and talking with them, and talking about the fact that, you know, maybe there are some issues that women have more understanding of, and many of the men, for example, in Kakuma camp, I was speaking to some men and they were saying, well, the women have a much better understanding of household needs, and so, you know, makes sense to talk to them because they have that understanding. So slowly you can kind of convince people to realize that we, you know, women have a contribution to make, even if there's still a culture which understands that women's role is primarily in the home.
Thank you, Anna. I would like to add a few more points, as you were encouraging me to add something from my country or my community about how the women are harmed when they go out or they do coordination. Some of the points were addressed in your answers or in my questions, I would like to add 2 or 3 more. For example, one of the reason that the women in Afghanistan can't participate well in some important meetings or in decision making issues or anything you think. One major reason is lack of education, because more of the women in Afghanistan lack of education, and they don't have enough education. Therefore, it decreases their ability to participate well. Another thing is when most of the women think that there is a lack of enough women within the organizations or humanitarian agencies, as we talked earlier, and also they don't feel that they are responsible for working outside or earn money, because most of them think, or that's the case, that most women work inside the house, even though they don't see them as working. But this is their work, but inside the houses. But another reason that can be said is a lack of awareness among the male community. They're lacking this awareness that and they are in mind that whenever women go outside, that's a kind of shame, that's a kind of stigmatization, and therefore this could decrease the ability of the women to go outside easily or willing to go outside to participate in decision making or anything that's important for their life. So these were the main point according to my mind that hinder women to participate well in the community.
Thanks a lot, Eleanor. Anna, do you want to comment? Then we have still one question from Eleanor.
No, nothing to add, but thanks, Ellen. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Eleanor. So, Eleanor, there is a question from your side.
Yes. Hi, Anna. So my question is about what you mentioned, the funding that you mentioned about the fact that the women are more interested in the community issues, and they take more care of the community issues rather than looking only at the issues that they're facing at the household level. So my question is, did you also research on how the women leaders are coordinating back with the broader female residents in the sites, and to what extent they are really representing all the female residents of the site, women and girls, because I feel that sometimes we have the tendency to involve in coordination role women that are already well respected, or that are already in a position of not power, but yeah, I would say well respected within the community, and there might be even issue within the female residents themselves, and sometimes they might not be fully representing the broader female community in the site. And then if I can just add another very quick question that is connected to what Celeste asked, and to the list of recommendations that you presented to us. Sometimes we do have fundings for 1 year intervention. We don't know how long we can stay after 1 year. Sometimes we have a lot of like donor restriction. Not all the donors will found in a CCM project a literacy component or a livelihood component. So from this point of view in mind, out of all the recommendations that you have gone through, do you have some recommendation that you just to prioritize for maybe short-term intervention? They might not last them more than 9 months or 1 year.
Very good and difficult questions. So on the first one about how women leaders are kind of coordinating back with community members or representing community members, It's not something that I could really look in detail at during the research, but I think it's something that every camp management agency should kind of include in part of their monitoring of their support to governance structures, not just for women, but also for men. But based on kind of some of what I picked up during the research and other occasions, the kind of most active women would be like actually arranging meetings with other women in the community, or going and visiting kind of door to door. And what I found was that their kind of the way in which they were coordinating and communicating with community members was improved if they were given specific tasks and kind of templates to do so. So if they were given like a particular issue that they needed to investigate and that they needed to talk to community members about, and this is why there's the recommendation to develop the safety mapping tool into something that the women themselves can use with other women in the community. So to actually really encourage that dynamic of communication between themselves and people in the community. But it's a tricky one, because when you talk to the women, you ask, oh, you know, do people know that you're a representative? Like, how do you talk to them? They'll say, oh, everyone knows I'm a representative, and they come and talk to me. But you obviously have to then talk to the community as well to see, okay, are you going and speaking to them? Are you sharing your problems with them? And it seems to depend a bit on the personality of the women as well. On the second question about funding, yes, I mean, I find it extremely frustrating that most funding cycles for camp management are only 1 year, because whoever heard of a camp that only lasted for 1 year, or any displacement context for that matter. And community engagement and support to community governance takes a long time. You can't do it in 1 year. You can set up some of the steps, but to actually start to have an impact, you have to go on for longer. So I think kind of all funding proposals should like hint at that and kind of make it clear that, you know, there's a limit as to what can be done in 1 year and that further funding would be needed. In terms of what to prioritize, so then another point is, I think that's where coordination with other agencies who might have slightly different remits and therefore might have longer funding cycles would be really important. So, and particularly this might be relevant in kind of out of camp context where you might also have development actors, but to try and get them involved. And if you can find another agency that has longer funding and would be willing to provide literacy training, for example, for the women from your governance structures, then, you know, that's great. They can handle that and you don't have to worry about it in your budget. But in terms of what should be prioritized, I mean, the establishment of the structure in the first place, if it's not already existing, and then like providing the information about service providers and how to contact service providers. I think that's, and then the like physical introductions and meetings between the service providers and the women and also men from governance mechanisms. I'd say that's like your bare minimum to ensure that women are involved in coordination.
Okay, I think we have to close here the plenary session for questions, because we still have 50 minutes, but Mario will need a bit of time just to talk about the working group and maybe a little bit about next steps. Of course, I mean, these topics could be also, we can keep continuing discussing and develop some of the points you raised during the working group. So Mario, would you like?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
So I think I might have forgotten to mention this at the beginning of the webinar, but the intention of this webinar was really to kickstart the working group and to spark inspiration for what we might be looking at in terms of tools and guidance, what our work plan could be. And although the presentation and your questions kind of gave us a lot of inspiration, I think, already, and good ideas of what we could be working on, I did want to ask all of you as to what you think that we could really be working on. What are the needs that you are facing as practitioners in the field, looking at participation displacement, not just of women and girls, but in general, looking at vulnerable groups, so also also acknowledging the fact that we might be looking at persons with disabilities, for example, adolescent girls, boys, LGBTQI community. So all of those vulnerable groups within a formal site, informal settlement, in an urban displacement context. What are the challenges that you are facing with? And looking at what the working group could be, do you have any recommendations for us, any tips, anything that comes to mind that you want to share with us?
Hi. From our side, from Somalia, since we're just starting to think about the Women's Participation Project, one of the things that came up a lot was the issue of trainings, and that's probably where we're going to start. So for me, it would be super useful to know if others have done this type of trainings before, like if there is like some curriculums available or any material that we can use, just not to have to draft everything from zero, which will be a lot of work. I understand that it will have to be adapted, but if there is anything out there, we would be very happy to take a look. So like, yeah, compiling information on education or training interventions in regard of participation would be super useful for us. Thanks.
Thank you, Celeste.
Hi, Mario, can I add on that one?
Hi, Ingrid, of course.
Yeah, so I was also listening, and these were very interesting questions. And in terms of like how the women saw their needs for capacity building and training, so Anna said like in different contexts, how they articulated it. And I think one opportunity for the working group, I think we have been working already with UN Women, and I don't know in some missions, but they have, because we have adapted their module on women's empowerment, participation, and leadership. And it's really a very self-paced program that we did for Bangladesh. And if Connie is around here, I think Mario knows also the project very well, right? And looking at the capacity building component, I saw how they really like articulated from the zero idea, their other concept of participation, to like even looking at their next generation. So like for them, they have identified many barriers, like even early marriage came often in the discussion, which relates to literacy, access, limitation on that one. So they said like for their daughters, they're looking at, so it broadens and expanded. So the program that UN Women did for this particular context, I think it's also can be adapted. It can be adapted if the working group can engage with them. And talking with the coordinator here, they're planning like a phase 2. So that's why since their module was like done also through research, context-based. So the phase 2, I'm looking forward how we can adapt it. And Celeste have also seen that here in Bangladesh. And then Mario, if I can move to another question. So that one was, a response to Celeste. Second is a question. I'm interested if the study of Anna is expanded, or maybe I just missed the first part, but have this expanded like for those country missions that we have done, women's participation, engagement, and like out of displacement setting. Although I know our study and our program is in displacement, but like looking at where they are now, maybe for a working group would be an interesting study, like how the impact continued together with those helpful factors that contributed, so that what we started in displacement setting may have continued on. So that's one. And then for the question, I think of Elena, in terms of sustainability, what we saw that is working here is like collaborating with TRD, because their social cohesion is a long term. I understand in terms of our programming and budgets limitations. So TRD, Transition and Recovery Division, has a program on social cohesion. So we are working on that one. So that may be one aspect that we can explore with our partners and partner sectors. And then, so those 2 points, UN Women and in terms of sustainability with TRD. So those are my thoughts on this one. Thank you and great work.
Thank you so much, Ingrid.
Mario, there is one question about the membership. Did you see it? Okay.
Yeah, I saw it. So just, yeah, thank you, Ingrid, for commenting on Celeste's question. Celeste, I know you were involved in the Women's Participation Project in Bangladesh, so you know the training package already, but I think that's a very good recommendation. Also noting that continuing to look at the types of displacement where Anna did her research, it's definitely something that we find very valuable as well, and we do want to continue exploring this. Gio, please correct me if I'm wrong, or and we also see the added value to the toolkit that we currently have under the Women's Participation Project, which is, as you see, Ingrid, aimed mostly at more formal sites. So we definitely want to continue this work, also noting the continuation of coordinating with development agencies. TRD is very specifically for IOM, but in general, I think there's definitely possibilities there. Wanjira, I'm reading your question on the membership of the working group. The membership is open to anyone who wants to contribute. We find it very useful to have as many colleagues present from as many different locations and operations. So if you agree to this, you're now officially part of the working group mailing list. And this goes for all of you who are participating. Please let us know if at any point you want to be taken off the mailing list, but we would like to continue the conversation with all of you. And then Elena, you have... Yes, very good point. I know you are chairing the capacity development working group. So go ahead.
It's just because yesterday we met and we kind of like acknowledge among ourselves that capacity building really underpin also other working groups. So I think it would be also interesting to have maybe some bilateral discussion on how we can cooperate in the next year, as well as maybe like an input for the working group, for the participation working group could be in certain contexts like Somalia, we have a lot of issues surrounding clans and how belong to a certain clan affect your participation and your access to resources. And of course, it's even more difficult because you cannot really talk about this openly, being like, okay guys, so which clans are in this site? So anything that is related to inclusive participation in this sense, either on an ethnic basis or on clan basis, when there are tensions between the different communities living in the site. So how can we make sure that everyone participate and nothing explodes or anything like that?
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, Elena, and I know that there's a lot of discussions ongoing about a more ethnographic or anthropological approach to really identifying these community structures and dynamics when we work with clans and tribes. I'm definitely taking note. I think it's super interesting. And Jen, I'm also seeing your question on tackling the topic of messaging to men and leadership structures. I had also written it down, so I'm happy to see that you are mentioning it as well. Do you want to elaborate on it, or is it fine to leave it like this?
I'm sure that, you know, in launching your working group, that you're putting together different thematic areas that would be important, and I really appreciate all the tender work that's gone into understanding what are some of the barriers and addressing them through a dedicated program. But I think we need to also look at complementary actions, and that's why I was asking Anna that very difficult question about how do you message back to the men's leadership groups, or, you know, kind of what can you do to try to break some of those impasses? Because even with really great training materials and capacity building and understanding the barriers that are there in dedicated programming, then we run into the challenge of trying to convince why we need this structural shift. And I think so if you could work on helping us to be able to just get some very key, you know, kind of messages out there, I think it would be really useful as a complementary action.
No, thank you, Jen, for mentioning that. I know that there's a lot of work being done already on working with men, or more specifically with leadership structures, and then very specifically with religious leaders. So there's a few toolkits that exist, such as Sasa Faith, for example, which could be very helpful. Of course, those have been developed for more development settings, so it would be interesting to look at which aspects we can take from those and apply them to the more emergency settings we work in. But I agree that it's very important, and because we are working with such difficult topics, like cultural barriers, we're looking at behavioral change, social norm change, and we will never get to that point if we don't work, of course, with the men and leadership structures in a community. I also wrote down a few other points, and we don't have that much time left, but of course this conversation does need to stop here. I wrote down that we could also, for example, work on measuring concepts such as participation, representation, and what the impact might be of the interventions that we put in place on women's participation, women's leadership and empowerment. Also took note of the advocacy role that we could play in terms of funding proposals and the timelines for those. I'm seeing a few messages come in. Anna, you mentioned developing guidance on how to create and structure governance mechanisms to ensure inclusivity, looking at different kinds of contexts, definitely.
Yeah. Like, for example, sometimes if you've got single sex governance mechanisms, and in other cases they're mixed, how you make sure they're working with each other, how you decide which option to go for, like all those decisions about like how you structure your governance mechanisms.
Yeah, definitely. No, thank you all so much for your inputs and for your ideas. I think this really gave us a clear idea of what we can do and how we can structure our work more thematically. So we only have a few minutes left. So I would just like to thank Anna so much for your presentation. It was really, really interesting. Of course, I knew what was in your report already, but it was really interesting to hear it again. Thank you, Gio, for hosting. And thank you all for your inspiration, for your time. We will be in touch soon with the recording of the webinar, but we will also be sharing the summary reports and the full reports with you in the very near future. We will
and
be...
the presentation.
And the presentation. And the presentation. We will also be in touch soon on the next meeting, which will probably consist again of a shorter presentation on a best practice in the field, and then we might be more work oriented toward a specific thematic area, but that's still to be determined. But anyway, you will hear from us very soon. Thank you all again, and we look forward to continuing this conversation with all of you.
Thank you very much to everybody.
Bye.
Bye, thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.